I had no idea that a broken crayon would change my entire life. I saw him sitting there at his desk, completely alone while the other children clustered together in groups of 3 and 4. His small hands were struggling to hold the crayon steady, like it kept slipping through his fingers no matter how hard he tried to grip it. The frustration was written all over his face, and there was something in his eyes that broke my heart, a kind of confusion that only someone who feels misunderstood by the whole world could have. I wasn't a teacher, just a community volunteer who came to this elementary school twice a week to help out with the art class. But when I looked at him, something shifted inside my chest. The classroom was loud with the usual chaos of 20 excited kids, but he sat in his own bubble of silence. His paper was blank except for a few scattered marks where the crayon had slipped. I could see him getting more upset with each failed attempt, his shoulders hunching forward as if he wanted to disappear into himself. I walked over slowly, not wanting to startle him. "Hey there," I said gently, crouching down beside his desk so we were at eye level. "Do you want me to help you with that?" He looked up at me with the biggest brown eyes I'd ever seen, filled with a mix of confusion and defensiveness. "I can do it myself," he said, but his voice wavered just enough to tell me he wasn't sure. "I know you can," I replied with what I hoped was an encouraging smile. "But sometimes it's easier when someone holds the paper steady for you. That way you can focus on drawing whatever you want." He hesitated, studying my face like he was trying to figure out if I was going to judge him the way everyone else seemed to. Then, very slowly, he extended the crayon toward me. His hand was trembling slightly. I took hold of the paper, pressing it flat against the desk. "Okay, now try." He positioned the crayon carefully and drew a line. It was a bit wobbly, but it was complete. The moment he finished it, his entire face lit up with the most beautiful smile I'd ever seen. It was pure and genuine, the kind of happiness that comes from achieving something you thought was impossible. "I'm Max," he said, speaking his name like it was a precious secret he was sharing with only me. "I'm Kenny," I told him. "It's really nice to meet you, Max." For the next 20 minutes, Max drew while I sat beside him, occasionally steadying the paper or handing him a different color when he needed it. The teachers were busy managing the chaos of the other students, and the noise level in the room was almost deafening. But in our little corner, it felt like we existed in our own peaceful world. Max worked slowly and deliberately, creating a picture of a blue car parked in front of a red house. It was simple, but there was something beautiful about the care he put into each stroke. "You did an amazing job," I said when he finally set down the crayon. His cheeks flushed pink. "My dad doesn't think I can do anything right. He gets mad when I mess up." My heart twisted painfully in my chest. "Then your dad is wrong about you." Max looked at me with an expression of complete shock, as if no one had ever contradicted his father's judgment before. In that moment, I made a silent promise to myself. I would help this child however I could, no matter what it took. But I had absolutely no idea who his father actually was. The bell rang, signaling the end of class, and children began pouring out of the room in a chaotic rush of backpacks and laughter. I helped Max gather his things, making sure his drawing was carefully placed in his folder so it wouldn't get crumpled. He seemed reluctant to leave, lingering by the desk even as the other kids rushed past us. "Will you be here next week?" he asked quietly. "I'll be here," I promised. Same time. That seemed to satisfy him, and he finally headed toward the door. I followed him out, intending to walk to my car and head home, but I stopped dead in my tracks when I saw the parking lot. There was a black SUV parked near the entrance, sleek, expensive, and somehow menacing despite just sitting there. Standing beside it was a man who commanded attention without even trying. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that stretched the fabric of his tailored suit. His jawline was sharp enough to cut glass, and there was an intensity radiating from him that made the air feel heavier. The suit he wore was clearly expensive, but it didn't make him look professional or corporate. Instead, it made him look dangerous. Max ran toward him, his small backpack bouncing against his shoulders. "Dad!" The man, Max's father, bent down and lifted Max into his arms with practiced ease. But his expression didn't soften even a fraction. It remained cold, calculated, like he was constantly assessing everything around him for potential threats. He set Max down after a moment, and that's when his eyes landed on me. I had no logical reason to be standing there staring at them, but my feet seemed rooted to the ground. His eyes were gray, the color of storm clouds, and they were absolutely piercing. They weren't just looking at me. They were analyzing me, taking in every detail. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice low and sharp enough to make me straighten my spine instinctively. "I'm Kenny," I managed to say, trying to keep my voice steady despite the way my heart was hammering. "I volunteer with the art class." He didn't respond immediately. Instead, his gaze traveled over me from head to toe in a way that made me feel completely exposed, like he was evaluating whether I posed any kind of threat to him or his son. The scrutiny was intense and uncomfortable. Max, oblivious to the tension, jumped in excitedly. "Kenny helped me draw today, Dad. Look at what I made." He pulled out his folder and showed his father the drawing with obvious pride. The man took the paper, glanced at it briefly, then looked back at me. His expression hadn't changed at all. "Thanks," he said. But the word carried no warmth. It was less of a "accu" and more of a warning. A clear message that I should keep my distance. He handed the drawing back to Max, placed a hand on his son's shoulder and guided him toward the SUV. I stood there watching them drive away, my heart still pounding against my ribs like it was trying to escape my chest. I had no idea that the man was a crime boss who controlled half the city's underground operations. And I had absolutely no idea that he would be seeking me out again very soon. I couldn't stop thinking about him. Max's father. Those storm gray eyes haunted me for days afterward. I kept replaying the way he'd looked at me, like I was some kind of puzzle he was trying to solve but couldn't quite figure out. His voice had been cold and commanding, the kind of voice that people probably obeyed without question. I tried to convince myself that I'd never see him again, that our interaction had been a one-time thing. He would drop Max off and pick him up, and we'd exist in completely separate worlds. That's what made sense, but life apparently had other plans for me. The following Tuesday, I was in my studio apartment around 11 at night, getting ready for bed after a long shift at the coffee shop where I worked to pay rent. I just changed into sweatpants and an old t-shirt when there was a firm knock at my door. My first thought was that maybe it was a package delivery, even though it seemed way too late for that. I walked over and opened the door without checking the peephole first. Standing in my hallway, filling the entire doorframe with his presence, was Max's father. What I started to say, but he was already moving past me into my apartment without waiting for an invitation. "We need to talk," he said simply, closing the door behind him with a decisive click. My heart rate immediately kicked into overdrive. "About what? Did something happen to Max? Is he okay?" "Max is perfectly fine," he said, his tone measured and controlled. "But you helped him. You showed him kindness when most people wouldn't bother." "So what if I did?" I asked, feeling defensive despite not knowing why. "Is that somehow against the rules?" He turned to face me fully, and I saw something flicker in those gray eyes. Something I couldn't quite identify. It might have been confusion or perhaps even gratitude, though that seemed unlikely given his demeanor. "Most people ignore my son," he said, and for the first time, his voice carried a hint of something softer underneath the steel. "His teachers, the other children, even their parents. They all think he's too much work, too difficult to deal with." "He's not difficult," I said firmly, meeting his gaze even though everything in me wanted to look away from the intensity. "He just needs someone to be patient with him. He needs someone to actually see him instead of just seeing his struggles." He took a long, slow breath, and I noticed the tension in his shoulders ease just slightly. "My name is Maverick." "Maverick," I repeated, testing the name on my tongue. It suited him, strong, unconventional, slightly dangerous. "I want to hire you to tutor him," he said abruptly, catching me completely off guard. I stared at him in disbelief. "What? I'm not a certified teacher. I don't have any formal training in education or child development. I don't care about certifications or credentials," he said, taking a step closer to me. The space between us seemed to shrink dramatically. "Max trusts you, and that's something incredibly rare. He doesn't trust easily, especially not strangers." I wanted to refuse. Every logical part of my brain was screaming that this was a bad idea, that getting involved with this intense, mysterious man and his son would only lead to complications I wasn't prepared for. But then I remembered Max's smile when he'd completed that drawing, the way his whole face had lit up with pride and joy. I remembered how small and alone he'd looked sitting at that desk. "All right," I heard myself say. "I'll do it." Something in Maverick's expression shifted, his jaw relaxed fractionally, and the hard line of his mouth softened almost imperceptibly. Good. He reached out and placed his hand on my shoulder. The weight of it was substantial, warm through the thin fabric of my t-shirt, and unmistakably possessive. But I need you to understand something, Kenny. If you hurt my son in any way, if you disappoint him or let him down, he let the sentence trail off, unfinished, but I understood the implication perfectly. The threat hung in the air between us, unspoken but crystal clear. I would never hurt him, I said quietly. He studied my face for a long moment, those gray eyes searching for any sign of deception. Whatever he saw must have satisfied him because he nodded once and dropped his hand from my shoulder. Sessions will start this Thursday, he said, back to business. I'll send a car to pick you up at 4 in the afternoon. Be ready. Then he walked to my door, opened it, and left without another word. I stood in the middle of my small apartment, my body trembling with adrenaline, trying to process what had just happened. I just agreed to enter into some kind of arrangement with a man I knew absolutely nothing about. A man who radiated danger and power in equal measure. A man whose presence in my apartment had made the space feel simultaneously smaller and more charged with energy than it ever had before. I walked to my window and looked down at the street below, watching as Maverick climbed into the same black SUV I'd seen at the school. Even from 4 stories up, I could feel the weight of whatever I'd just agreed to. What kind of deal had I actually made? And more importantly, where was this arrangement going to lead me? I didn't have answers to those questions, but as I got into bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that my life had just taken a turn into territory I'd never imagined exploring. The man's gray eyes stayed with me even as I closed my own, and I found myself wondering what secrets lay behind them. Thursday suddenly felt both too far away and not nearly far enough. I had 2 days to prepare myself for whatever came next, but I had no idea what I was actually preparing for. All I knew was that I'd made a promise to help Max, and I intended to keep it, even if it meant stepping into a world I didn't understand, with a father whose intensity both frightened and intrigued me in ways I wasn't ready to examine too closely. The car that picked me up on Thursday was exactly what I should have expected. Another sleek black vehicle with tinted windows and leather seats that probably cost more than 6 months of my rent. The driver didn't speak to me at all during the 30-minute journey, and I spent the entire ride staring out the window, watching as the familiar streets of my neighborhood gradually gave way to areas I'd only seen in magazines. When we finally stopped, I had to consciously keep my jaw from dropping. Calling it a mansion felt inadequate. The building that rose before me was more like a private palace, all clean modern lines and enormous windows that reflected the afternoon sun. The driveway was paved with stones that looked hand-placed, and there were perfectly manicured gardens stretching out on either side. This wasn't just wealth. This was the kind of fortune that most people couldn't even comprehend. The driver opened my door, and I stepped out onto the immaculate driveway, feeling completely out of place in my simple jeans and button-down shirt. A woman in a crisp uniform appeared immediately, greeting me with a polite nod but no smile. "Please follow me. Sir, Master Max is waiting in the library." Master Max? The formal title felt strange for such a young child, but I didn't comment on it. Instead, I followed her through the massive front entrance and into the house itself. The interior was even more impressive than the exterior. Marble floors stretched in every direction, polished to such a high shine that I could see my reflection in them. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceilings, catching and refracting light into tiny rainbows. But what struck me most was the silence. Despite seeing several staff members moving quietly through the halls, no one spoke. They all moved with practiced efficiency, their expressions carefully neutral, as if they'd been trained to be invisible. The atmosphere was almost eerie. It felt less like a home and more like a museum. Beautiful but cold, impressive but unwelcoming. I couldn't imagine what it must be like for an energetic child to grow up in such a sterile environment. The woman led me to a room at the end of a long hallway and opened the double doors to reveal the library. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 3 walls, filled with leather-bound volumes that looked more decorative than read. In the center of the room was a large table with comfortable chairs, and sitting at that table, swinging his legs excitedly, was Max. His face broke into a huge grin the moment he saw me. "Kenny, you came." The joy in his voice made all the strangeness of the house fade into the background. "Of course I came," I said, walking over to him. "I promised, didn't I?" "My dad said you were going to teach me stuff," Max said, bouncing slightly in his seat. Real teaching, not like school. Well, I'm going to try my best, I told him, sitting down beside him. But you have to promise me something first. What? He asked, eyes wide with curiosity. You have to promise to tell me when you need a break, okay? If things get too hard or you start feeling frustrated, we'll stop and do something else for a bit. Deal? He nodded enthusiastically. Deal. We started with his homework from school, basic mathematics problems and a spelling worksheet. Right away I could see the challenges he faced. His attention would drift after just a minute or two, his eyes wandering to the window or his fingers drumming restlessly on the table. When he tried to write, his hand would grip the pencil too tightly, making his letters shaky and uneven. He'd get frustrated quickly, his face scrunching up with anger at himself. But I'd done my research over the past 2 days, reading everything I could find about teaching children with attention difficulties. I'd prepared games and visual aids, breaking each task into smaller, more manageable pieces. When Max struggled with subtraction, I pulled out colored blocks I'd brought with me and let him physically move them around to see the numbers in action. When spelling became tedious, we turned it into a drawing game where he'd illustrate each word. Slowly, bit by bit, I watched him start to engage. His eyes would light up when he understood a concept, and he'd attack the next problem with renewed energy. It wasn't smooth or easy, but we were making progress. This is actually kind of fun, Max said at one point, coloring in a diagram we'd made together. Learning should be fun, I replied. It's not supposed to feel like punishment. We'd been working for about an hour when I felt a presence in the doorway. I looked up to find Maverick standing there, arms crossed over his chest, watching us with an unreadable expression. He was wearing another expensive suit, this one charcoal gray, and he looked every bit as intimidating as he had in my apartment. Max immediately tensed when he noticed his father, his shoulders hunching forward defensively. The change in his demeanor was instant and heartbreaking. Keep working, Maverick said, his tone clipped and authoritative. Don't let me interrupt. But his presence had already interrupted. Max's hand started shaking as he tried to continue coloring, and he knocked over the box of crayons, sending them scattering across the table. His face flushed with embarrassment. It's okay, I said quietly, helping him gather them up. Accidents happen to everyone. Maverick remained in the doorway for another few minutes before finally leaving without another word. The moment he was gone, Max's shoulders relaxed again, but the damage was done. His concentration was broken, and I could see tears gathering in his eyes. Does your dad get angry with you a lot? I asked gently. Max nodded, not meeting my eyes. He thinks I'm stupid because I can't do things right. He yells when I make mistakes. My heart broke for this child. Max, look at me, I said, waiting until he raised his eyes to mine. You are not stupid. Your brain just works differently than other people's brains. And that's not a bad thing. It just means we have to find different ways for you to learn. Really? His voice was so small, so hopeful. Really, I confirmed. And you know what? I think your dad does care about you, even if he doesn't show it the way you need him to. Over the following weeks, I came to the mansion 3 times a week. Each session revealed more about Max's world. A world of strict schedules, high expectations, and very little warmth. The staff never spoke to him beyond what was necessary. His meals were served at exact times in a formal dining room where he ate alone unless Maverick joined him, which was rare. His bedroom, while filled with expensive toys, felt more like a showroom than a child's space. But in our sessions, Max began to blossom. His confidence grew with each small success, and he started to believe that maybe he wasn't broken after all. He just needed someone who was willing to meet him where he was instead of demanding he change to fit their expectations. And Maverick? He continued to appear at random times, always watching, never interfering, but I began to notice something in the way he looked at his son, a hunger almost. Like he wanted to connect but had absolutely no idea how to bridge the gap he'd created. Something was wrong with Max. The change happened almost overnight, and it was impossible to ignore. When I arrived for our Tuesday session, he barely looked up from where he sat hunched over the library table. The enthusiasm that usually lit up his face when I walked through the door was completely absent, replaced by a blank, distant expression that made my stomach twist with worry. Hey buddy, I said, settling into the chair beside him. Ready to tackle some reading comprehension today? Sure, he mumbled, still not meeting my eyes. I pulled out the materials I'd prepared, but Max just stared at them without moving. His hands stayed in his lap, fingers twisting together anxiously. The drawing supplies I'd brought, ones he normally grabbed immediately, sat untouched on the table. "Max, what's going on?" I asked gently, setting aside the worksheets. "You seem really upset about something." "Nothing's wrong," he said to the table. "Can we just start?" But everything was wrong. Over the next hour, I watched him struggle through exercises that he'd mastered weeks ago. He wouldn't engage with the games I suggested, wouldn't draw the visual aids that usually helped him understand concepts. Most troubling of all, he flinched every time I reached out to point at something on the page, as if he expected me to hit him. When the session ended, I tried to talk to Maverick, but he was nowhere to be found. One of the staff members, a stern-faced woman who never smiled, informed me that he was unavailable and that the car would take me home immediately. No waiting, no questions. The same thing happened Thursday, and again on Saturday. Max grew more withdrawn each time I saw him, and Maverick seemed to be actively avoiding me. When I tried to stay late after one session hoping to catch him, 2 guards appeared from nowhere and politely but firmly escorted me to the waiting car. The mansion's atmosphere had shifted too. The silence that had always been present now felt oppressive, suffocating. Staff members moved through the halls with their heads down, and I noticed several new faces, men in dark suits who stood at various corners, watching everything with cold, calculating eyes. Something bad was happening, and no one would tell me what it was. The following Tuesday, our session ended early because Max claimed he had a headache. I knew he was lying, but I didn't push it. As I gathered my materials, I heard raised voices coming from outside. The shouting was muffled by the thick walls, but unmistakably angry. Every logical part of my brain told me to get in the car and leave. This wasn't my business. These people weren't my family. I was just the tutor. But Max's frightened face kept flashing through my mind, and my feet carried me toward the sound before I could second-guess myself. I found a side door that led to the garden and slipped outside, staying close to the building's shadow. The voices grew clearer as I moved around the corner, and I recognized Maverick's distinctive tone immediately, low and dangerous, filled with barely controlled rage. "You must be incredibly stupid to come to my home," Maverick was saying. I peered around the edge of a marble pillar and saw him standing near the fountain, facing another man. The stranger was older, maybe in his 50s, with slicked-back gray hair and an expensive suit that matched Maverick's in quality. But unlike Maverick's controlled stillness, this man radiated nervous energy. "I'm just delivering a message," the stranger said, though his voice wavered slightly. "My employer wants what he's owed." "Your employer can go to hell," Maverick replied, each word precise and cutting. "And you can tell him that threatening my son was the last mistake he'll ever make." The stranger laughed, a short, harsh sound with no humor in it. "So the rumors are true. The great Maverick does have a weakness after all. That boy has made you soft." "Leave," Maverick said quietly. "While you still can, your sentimentality will destroy you." The stranger continued, apparently not smart enough to recognize how much danger he was in. "Everyone knows about the tutor too. How touching that you've brought some nobody into our home to play house with you in your defect." The gunshot was deafening in the quiet evening air. I watched, frozen in absolute horror, as the stranger crumpled to the ground. Maverick stood over him, gun still raised, expression completely unchanged. There was no anger on his face, no satisfaction, no remorse. Just cold, clinical efficiency. My hands flew to my mouth to hold back the scream that threatened to escape. My whole body started shaking uncontrollably, and I stumbled backward, knocking into a decorative planter that scraped loudly against the stone path. Maverick's head snapped toward the sound, and his eyes locked onto mine. For a moment we just stared at each other. His face remained impassive, but I saw the recognition in his eyes, the understanding that I'd witnessed everything. "Kenny," he said, his voice carrying easily across the garden. "Come out here." I couldn't move. My legs felt like they'd been filled with concrete. "Kenny," he repeated, firmer this time. "Don't make me come get you." Somehow I managed to step out from behind the pillar. Each footstep toward him felt like walking through water, my body fighting against every instinct, screaming at me to run. When I was close enough, I could see the blood splattered on Maverick's shirt cuff. My stomach churned violently, and I had to focus on breathing to keep from being sick. "You watched that happen?" Maverick stated flatly. "Yes." I whispered. He holstered his gun beneath his jacket with practiced ease, then looked at me with those penetrating gray eyes. So now you understand what kind of man I really am. Tears started streaming down my face without my permission. You killed him. You didn't even hesitate. No, I didn't, Maverick agreed. Because hesitation in my world gets people killed. Hesitation gets my son killed. He took a step closer and I flinched backward instinctively. Something flickered across his face. It might have been hurt, but it disappeared too quickly for me to be sure. I won't keep you here against your will, he said, gesturing toward the house. The front door is unlocked. You can walk out right now and I'll make sure you're compensated for your time. You'll never hear from us again. My mind raced, trying to process everything. This man was a murderer, a criminal, dangerous in ways I'd never fully understood until this moment. But if you leave, Maverick continued, his voice dropping lower, Max loses the only person who's ever looked at him like he matters. The only person who's ever made him feel like he's not broken. From somewhere in the house I heard Max's small voice calling out, Kenny? Are you leaving? I looked up at the mansion. At the lit window I knew was the library. I thought about Max sitting there alone, probably terrified by the gunshot, wondering if I was going to abandon him like everyone else in his life had. I'm staying, I heard myself say. Maverick's expression shifted subtly. Surprise, then relief, then something harder to define. Then you need to understand the rules of this world. Once you're in, there's no walking away. You become part of this. Part of me. Do you comprehend what that means? I nodded slowly, even though I wasn't entirely sure I did understand. Say it, Maverick demanded. I'm staying, I repeated. Stronger this time, whatever that means, I'm choosing to stay. 3 weeks passed after that night in the garden. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen. Who would I tell? And what would I even say? Instead, I showed up for every scheduled session with Max, pretending that my world hadn't been fundamentally altered by watching a man die in front of me. But everything had changed, whether I acknowledged it or not. Max slowly started coming back to himself. Whatever had been frightening him seemed to ease, and the withdrawn, scared child gradually transformed back into the enthusiastic learner I'd first met. He laughed again. He drew again. He told me rambling stories about the books he'd read and the games he wanted to play. I threw myself into helping him, using every technique I could research, spending hours preparing materials for each session. If I focused hard enough on Max's progress, I could almost forget about the body that had been lying in the garden. What I couldn't ignore was Maverick. He'd started attending our sessions more frequently, not just observing from the doorway anymore, but actually entering the library and sitting in one of the armchairs nearby. Sometimes he brought coffee for both of us. Expensive stuff from some Italian brand I'd never heard of. Other times he just sat quietly, watching us work with an intensity that made my skin prickle with awareness. His presence had shifted from intimidating to something else entirely. I'd catch him staring at me with an expression I couldn't decipher, something searching and hungry and confused all at once. And I found myself noticing things about him I'd overlooked before. The way his jaw tightened when Max successfully completed a difficult problem, like he was proud but didn't know how to express it. The way his fingers drummed against his thigh when he was thinking. The rare moments when his mouth would curve into an almost smile at something Max said. One evening, Max fell asleep early, exhausted from a particularly challenging session on fractions. I was shelving the books we'd used when I heard footsteps behind me. He's getting better, Maverick said from the doorway. He's incredibly bright, I replied, not turning around. He just needs information presented in ways that work with how his brain processes things. That's not what I meant. I finally looked at him. He'd loosened his tie and unbuttoned the top of his shirt, looking more relaxed than I'd ever seen him. But his eyes were as intense as always. He's happier, Maverick continued, walking into the room. More confident, less afraid. Children respond well when someone believes in them, I said carefully. And what about you? He stopped a few feet away, close enough that I could smell his cologne. Something expensive and masculine that made my pulse quicken inexplicably. How are you responding to all of this? What do you mean? You saw me end a man's life, Kenny. Most people would have run. But you're still here, showing up 3 times a week, acting like nothing happened. I set down the book I'd been holding, needing something to do with my hands. Max needs consistency. He needs to know that people won't abandon him just because things get difficult. Is that the only reason? The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implications I wasn't ready to examine. I don't know what you want me to say, I admitted quietly. Maverick moved closer, and I found myself backing up until I hit the bookshelf. He placed one hand on the shelf beside my head, not trapping me but definitely boxing me in. I want you to tell me why you really stayed, he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Because I've been trying to figure it out for weeks and nothing makes sense. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. Maybe I'm just an idiot who makes terrible decisions. No, he said firmly. You're intelligent and kind and see things other people miss. So tell me, why did you stay? I met his eyes, those storm-gray depths that had haunted my thoughts since the first moment I'd seen them. Because despite everything you are, despite what you do, you love your son, and anyone who loves someone that fiercely can't be completely irredeemable. Something cracked in his expression, a vulnerability I'd never seen before breaking through his carefully maintained control. You have no idea what you do to me, he said roughly. Watching you with Max, seeing the way you look at him like he hung the moon, the way you speak to him with such patience and care, it makes me wish I could be different. Better. The kind of man who deserves that gentleness. Maverick, I can't stop thinking about you, he interrupted, his free hand coming up to cup my face. His touch was surprisingly gentle for someone whose hands I'd seen commit violence. Every time you smile, every time you laugh at something Max says, every time you look at me without fear in your eyes, it consumes me, and I know I have no right to want you. But I do. God help me, I do. My breath caught in my throat. This powerful, dangerous man was standing in front of me, looking more uncertain than I'd ever imagined possible. This is insane, I whispered. I know, you're a criminal. You kill people. I know that too. I should be terrified of you, but you're not, he said, searching my face. Are you? And he was right. Somewhere along the way, my fear had transformed into something else entirely. Something that made my skin feel too tight and my thoughts scatter whenever he was near. No, I admitted, I'm not afraid of you. His thumb traced along my cheekbone, the gesture achingly tender. Then tell me to leave you alone. Tell me this is inappropriate and wrong, and I'll step back. I'll keep my distance. Just say the words. But I couldn't. Because as insane and impossible as it was, I didn't want him to step back. Instead, I did something that would change everything. I closed the distance between us and kissed him. For a heartbeat, Maverick froze in surprise. Then he responded, his arms coming around me and pulling me flush against him. The kiss was nothing like I'd imagined my first kiss with a man would be. It was desperate and consuming, filled with weeks of tension and want, and things neither of us had been willing to say out loud. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Maverick rested his forehead against mine. Tell me this is real, he demanded. Tell me I'm not imagining this. It's real, I confirmed, my hands fisted in his shirt. I don't understand it, and it probably makes me crazy, but it's real. You're mine now, he said fiercely. Whatever this is between us, you're mine. Completely. And standing there in the library with a sleeping child upstairs and a dangerous future ahead, I agreed. Yes, I'm yours. Time moves differently when you're living in a world you never imagined being part of. 2 months passed in what felt like both forever and no time at all. I continued tutoring Max, but now I also stayed for dinner most nights. Then I started spending weekends at the mansion. Then Maverick suggested I keep some clothes in one of the guest rooms, just for convenience. We never discussed labels or what we were to each other. In public, on the rare occasions we went anywhere together, we maintained careful distance. But in private, behind the mansion's walls, something new was growing between us. Something neither of us had words for, but both of us protected fiercely. Max thrived in the changed atmosphere. He started calling me Ken one day, shortening my name in that way children do when someone becomes truly important to them. The nickname stuck, and hearing it always made something warm bloom in my chest. More importantly, Max was opening up to Maverick in ways that seemed to shock them both. At dinner, he'd chatter about his day without prompting. He'd show his father the drawings he'd made during our sessions, explaining each element with enthusiastic detail. And slowly, painfully slowly, Maverick learned how to respond, how to praise without criticism, how to show interest without demanding perfection. I watched them build a relationship, and it was messy and imperfect, but it was real. One Sunday evening, I was reading Max a bedtime story, something about dragons and knights that he'd picked out himself. His eyes were drooping, the way they always did when he was fighting sleep because he didn't want the day to end. "Ken," he murmured, voice already thick with drowsiness. "Yeah, buddy, you're going to stay with us, right? Like forever?" My throat tightened. I set the book aside and brushed his hair back from his forehead. "Would you want that?" "Dad's different when you're here," he said, struggling to keep his eyes open. "He smiles now. He talks to me about stuff. And you make everything feel safe." "You make me feel safe too, Max. I love you, Ken," he whispered, finally losing the battle with sleep. "Don't leave us." I sat there for a long time after he drifted off, just watching him breathe. This child who'd been starved for affection and understanding had somehow worked his way into my heart completely. The idea of leaving him, of walking away from this strange family we were building, felt physically painful. When I finally left his room, I found Maverick on the terrace. He stood at the railing, looking out at the city lights spread below like scattered diamonds. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of jasmine from the gardens. He asked if I was staying, I said, moving to stand beside him. Maverick didn't look at me, but I saw his hands tighten on the railing. "What did you tell him?" I didn't give him a direct answer. "I wanted to talk to you first." "Why?" "'Cause this involves you too," I said simply. "This thing between us, whatever we're calling it. Max isn't the only reason I'm here anymore, and we both know it." Maverick turned to face me then, moonlight casting shadows across his sharp features. "What are you asking me, Kenny?" "I'm asking what you want. From me. From me." He reached out and took my hand, his grip firm and sure. "I want you to stay. Not as Max's tutor. Not as a guest in my home. I want you to be part of our lives permanently." My heart stuttered. "Maverick, I love you," he said, the words emerging like a confession he'd been holding back for too long. "I don't know when it happened or how, but I do. You've changed everything. The way I see myself. The way I interact with my son. The way I move through the world. I need you here." Tears blurred my vision. "You're asking me to build a life with a man who operates outside the law, who's made enemies I can't even imagine, who might not come home some nights." "I know what I'm asking," he said quietly, "and I know it's selfish. You deserve someone normal, someone safe, someone whose past isn't soaked in blood. But I'm asking anyway, because the thought of losing you is worse than anything my enemies could do to me." I looked at this complicated, dangerous, impossibly gentle man who'd somehow become essential to my happiness. "You're right that I deserve better." Pain flashed across his face, but he nodded. "I understand, but I don't want better," I interrupted. "I want you. I want Max. I want this messy, complicated, slightly terrifying life we're building together." The relief that washed over his expression was profound. He pulled me into his arms, holding me so tightly I could barely breathe, and I wrapped my arms around him just as fiercely. "Forever?" he asked against my hair. "Forever," I confirmed. He pulled back just enough to kiss me, and it was different from that first desperate kiss in the library. This was a promise, a commitment, a beginning. 4 months later, I stood in what was now officially our bedroom, mine and Maverick's, getting ready for Max's school presentation. The transformation of my life still felt surreal sometimes. I'd moved into the mansion completely, my tiny studio apartment abandoned for this sprawling estate that was slowly starting to feel like home. Max burst through the door without knocking, something he did constantly now that he felt secure enough to assume he was always welcome. "Ken, Dad, are you ready? We're going to be late." "We have 45 minutes, buddy," I said, laughing. "We're not going to be late, but I'm presenting first. I have to be early." Maverick emerged from the bathroom, adjusting his tie. He'd insisted on wearing a suit to the school presentation, wanting to look like a proper father. The fact that he cared enough to try made my chest ache with affection. "Let's go then," Maverick said, ruffling Max's hair, a gesture of casual affection that had taken months to develop. "Can't have you missing your moment." As we headed downstairs, Max between us, chattering excitedly about his presentation, I caught Maverick's eye. He smiled at me, a real genuine smile that transformed his entire face, and reached over Max's head to squeeze my hand briefly. This was my family. Unconventional, complicated, built on foundations that most people would consider questionable at best. But it was ours, and it was real. and it was filled with more love than I'd ever imagined possible. Max grabbed both our hands as we walked to the car, swinging between us. "This is perfect," he announced. "The three of us together." And looking at Maverick over Max's head, seeing the same overwhelming emotion reflected in his eyes that I felt in my chest, I had to agree. This was perfect. This was home. This was forever.